Her hands were not the hands of a young woman anymore. They were spotted, knuckled, strong in the way old roots are strong. And on that gray morning, they gripped the controls of a digging machine while the whole street watched from behind their curtains. The widow was carving a hole into her own backyard, a deep one, wide enough, the neighbors whispered, to bury something. Or someone. They had a name for her now. The crazy one. The old woman who talked to no one, who let her garden go to frost, who had not smiled since the winter the snow took her husband and the roads gave him back too late. Let them whisper. She knew what the soft people of that small town did not. She knew that warmth is a lie you rent from a wire, and that one bad winter can cut the strong from the living as cleanly as a blade. She had held a cold hand once, and sworn she would never be helpless again. So she dug, past the frost line, past the reach of any storm, and months later, when the sky turned a bruised and breathless black, and 50 families sat shivering in the dark with empty cupboards and silent phones. There was one house where the light still glowed, soft and green, beneath the snow. They had called her crazy. They were about to call her something else. The machine roared to life in the gray hour after dawn. Steel teeth bit into the cold ground, and dirt rose into the air like something disturbed from a long sleep. The old woman sat high in the cab, both hands steady on the controls, her chin lifted against the wind. Maris Calloway was 72 years old, and she was digging a hole in her own backyard the size of a swimming pool. Up and down the quiet street, curtains shifted. Faces appeared in frosted windows, then pulled away. A woman in a flannel robe stood on her porch with a coffee mug going cold in her hands, watching the way you watch a fire you can't put out. The town had a word for Maris now. They said it softly. They said it the way people say things they don't want to be caught saying. Crazy. The crazy widow. The one who let her flower beds die. The one who hadn't been seen at a single church supper in years. The one who, on this particular morning, appeared to be carving a grave wide enough to swallow a house. She knew what they thought. She did not care. By mid-morning, a polished SUV came crunching up the gravel drive. Out stepped Mayor Warren Pike, a tall man who loved order the way some men love a good lawn, trimmed even, predictable. He carried a clipboard like a shield, and he held it up as he crossed the torn earth toward her. Maris, he called over the engine. Maris, shut it down. She let the machine idle a moment longer than necessary. Then she killed it. The silence that rushed in afterward felt enormous. Somewhere, a crow complained. Loose dirt slid back into the pit with a soft whisper. She climbed down slowly, wiping her palms on her work jacket, and faced him with the calm of a woman who had nothing left to prove to anyone. "Warren," she said, "you're up early." "I had a call." He glanced at the pit and his jaw tightened. 3 calls, actually. People are concerned. You don't have a permit for whatever this is. He gestured at the wound in the ground. You're a good 30 feet from a property line. You've got noise complaints. And Glenda Marsh thinks you're building something out of a nightmare. Maris followed his eyes to the porch across the way. The woman in the flannel robe stepped back from the railing. "Tell Glenda," Maris said quietly, "that her imagination has always been her finest quality." Pike sighed. He was not a cruel man, just a careful one. And careful men are often the slowest to understand the people who have already lived through the worst. What is it? He asked. Really? She looked down into the pit, and something in her face softened. Not toward him, toward the hole itself, toward the work. It's a greenhouse, she said. He blinked. It's a what? Underground, sunk below the frost. The earth down deep stays warm, Warren. Warmer than you'd ever believe. South-facing glass on top, catches the low winter sun. Barrels of water to hold the heat through the night. She paused. Things grow down there. When everything up here is frozen solid, things still grow. For a moment, Pike simply stared at her. Then he laughed. Not unkindly, but he laughed. Maris, the market's a few miles down the road. We get a delivery truck twice a week. You want tomatoes? You buy tomatoes. You don't need to dig to the center of the earth. She did not laugh. She looked at him for a long, still moment, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped into something older, something with weight. The trucks don't always come, Warren. Maris! They didn't come once. And there it was. The thing the whole town knew, but never said out loud. The thing that hung over her house like the cold that never quite left it. Pike's smile faded, because everyone remembered the winter, the one that came down out of the mountains without warning, the one that buried the only road in and out under a wall of white so high the plows turned back. For days, the valley had been sealed off from the rest of the living world. No way in, no way out. And in a small house at the end of a quiet street, a man named Gideon Calloway had grown gravely ill. His wife had held his hand through the dark. She had wrapped him in every blanket they owned. She had waited for help that could not reach them, because the roads were gone, and the sky was a roaring blindness, and the world simply could not get to him in time. She had held that hand until it went cold. And when the snow finally cleared and the town came knocking with their casseroles and their sympathy, Maris Calloway had already learned the only lesson that mattered. That warmth is something you borrow. That a single bad winter can cut the strong from the living as cleanly as a blade. That help does not always come. Pike looked at the ground. He had been at the funeral. They all had. They had pitied her then. And somewhere in the years that followed, the pity had quietly curdled into something easier to carry. Irritation. It was simpler to call her crazy than to remember why she might not be. Maris, he said gently, Gideon's been gone a long time. This isn't going to bring him back. The wind moved across the open pit between them. No, she agreed. It isn't. She bent down, picked up a folded square of paper from the seat of the machine, and held it out to him. He took it without thinking, unfolded it. It was a drawing, a blueprint, really, but a tender one. Careful lines and gentle measurements, drawn in a hand that was not hers. In the corner, in faded pencil, a few words had been written long ago. For when the roads close, so we never wait again. Pike stared at it. He drew this, Maris said, years before. Sat at the kitchen table some nights, sketching it out like other men sketch a porch they'll never build. He used to say it like a joke. Her voice caught, just slightly, then steadied. And I used to laugh. She took the drawing back, folded it, returned it to her pocket like something holy. I'm not building it to bring him back, Warren, she said. I'm building it because I should have believed him the first time. For a long moment, the mayor said nothing. Then he remembered who he was and why he'd come. He cleared his throat. He reached for the clipboard. It's still not permitted, he said, though the words came out softer now. I have to cite you. $500. And if this structure isn't dealt with by month's end, the town can bring contractors. Put a lien on the house. I don't want to, but that's the rule. He tore the page free and held it out. She took it without looking at it. You've made yourself very clear, she said. He hesitated, as if there were something more he wanted to say. Some bridge he wanted to build across the torn ground between them, but he didn't know how. So he simply turned, climbed back into his clean SUV, and drove away, the citation already forgotten in the wind behind him. Maris Calloway stood alone in the cold. Across the street, the curtain in Glenda Marsh's window fell shut. She looked down at the slip of paper in her hand. The fine. The threat. The town's verdict, printed in plain black ink. She crumpled it slowly into a tight little ball and pushed it deep into her pocket, right beside the drawing. The town had given her a deadline. She did the math in her head, the way she'd once done it for a living, back when men in offices needed her numbers and pretended they hadn't. Weeks. That was all the time they would give her. Fine. She would simply finish it sooner. She climbed back into the cab, wrapped those spotted, knuckled, unbreakable hands around the controls one more time. And as the first soft flakes of an early snow began to drift down out of a pale and patient sky, the crazy widow started the engine again. The snow that came that first morning did not stay. It drifted down soft and uncertain, dusted the torn earth white for an hour, and then melted into the cold mud as if it had only come to take a look. As if even the sky was curious about what the old woman was building. Maris Calloway barely noticed it. She worked. She worked the way some people pray, with her whole body, with a kind of devotion that left no room for doubt. The machine bit deeper. The pit grew wider. And little by little, a shape began to rise out of the chaos of dirt and stone. Long and rectangular, and angled toward the south like a face turned up to catch what little light the winter would offer. She did not work fast. She worked exactly. Every wall measured twice, every corner squared to the inch, the slope of the floor calculated so that water would run where she wanted it, and never where she didn't. This was not the frantic digging of a woman undone by grief. This was the patient labor of someone who had built things before, real things, things that held. They had forgotten that, the people in this town. They saw a widow in a faded work jacket, and they filled in the rest of the story themselves. They did not see the decades she had spent bent over drawings that other people staked their lives on. They did not see the careful, invisible bones she had set beneath the things ordinary folks crossed without a second thought. She remembered the men in those offices, all those years ago, the way they used to take her drawings out of her hands and study them, and frown, and turn to her husband, who was not even an engineer, and ask him what he thought, as if the numbers needed a man's voice to be true. She remembered how she had learned to let it roll off her, the way you learn to let rain roll off a slicker. She remembered being right, again and again, in rooms full of people who had assumed she would be wrong. She had spent her whole life making sure that what looked solid, actually was, and being told her whole life that she could not possibly know what she so plainly knew. So perhaps it should not have surprised her. The whispering, the pointed fingers, the certainty of small minds that an old woman with a shovel could not possibly understand something they did not. She had heard that song before. She knew all its words. And now she was building, one last time, for no one's approval but her own. The reinforcements arrived on a long flatbed truck, pallets of heavy gray block, bags of resin and sealant, rolls of insulation thick as winter coats. The young man who delivered them chewed his gum and would not meet her eyes, and when he had finished unloading, he climbed back into his cab a little too quickly. She heard him on his phone as he pulled away. "Yeah, no, it's the crazy lady, the one everybody's talking about. You should see this hole, man. I'm not even kidding." She did not flinch. She had stopped flinching a long time ago. One block at a time, she lined the walls. She interlocked them. She sealed every seam against the slow, patient seep of groundwater, working the resin into the joints with hands that knew the difference between almost and enough. Her shoulders ached at night. Her knees protested every morning. She wrapped them in heat and old cloth and went back out at first light anyway, because the calendar was moving, and down in the deep ground where her hands lived now, she could feel the cold gathering its strength. Not the polite cold of an ordinary season. Something heavier. Something with intention. She could not have told you how she knew. She only knew that she did. The first of the boys came on a Friday night. She heard them before she saw them. The low growl of an engine slowing on the road, the heavy thump of music, the bright, cruel laughter of young people who have not yet been hurt enough to know better. Then glass shattered against the side of her house. A voice, gleeful in the dark, called out across the yard, "Hey, mole woman!" Laughter. "You digging your own grave out here? You want some help finishing it?" More laughter. Another bottle arced over the fence and landed somewhere in the soft dirt at the bottom of the pit. Maris stood at her kitchen window. She did not turn on the porch light. She did not pick up the phone. She simply stood there in the dark, a cup of tea going cold between her hands, and she watched the taillights finally pull away into the night. Then she put on her coat over her nightclothes, and she went out into the freezing dark, and she climbed down into the pit, and she picked every shard of glass out of the dirt by hand, so that none of it would ever touch the roots of what she was about to grow. It took her the better part of an hour. Her fingers went numb. The cold reached up through the soles of her boots and into the old bones of her feet. She did not cry. That, too, she had finished doing a long time ago. When she had found every last splinter of glass, she carried it inside in an old coffee can and set it by the door. And before she went up to bed, she stood for a moment at the window and looked out at the dark shape of the thing she was building. "They threw stones at you too, didn't they?" she said softly. Not to the boys, to the man who wasn't there. "Every fool with a good idea gets stones thrown at him. You always said so." The house gave her no answer. It never did. The newspaper came next. It was a small paper, the kind that survives on church suppers and bake sales and the occasional photograph of a record-breaking squash. And someone there, hunting for a laugh on a slow week, had drawn a cartoon. It showed an old woman in a pointed hat, hunched over a hole in the ground, clutching a single shriveled carrot to her chest like buried treasure. Beneath it, in cheerful, curling letters, "Local recluse strikes dirt." Glenda Marsh made certain that Maris saw it. She did not say a word about it, of course. She was far too well-mannered for that. She simply left the paper folded on top of Maris's mailbox one morning. That particular page turned face up, weighted against the wind with a small, smooth stone. A little gift. Maris found it on her way back from the lumber yard, her truck bed loaded with cedar for the planting beds. She stood at the end of her drive and read it, the cartoon woman grinning up at her with her ridiculous hat and her foolish carrot. And for one long moment, something hot and old rose up in her chest. Then it passed. She picked up the paper, folded it neatly along its crease, and carried it inside, where she pinned it to the wall above her workbench, right beside the careful, tender drawing in her late husband's hand, the mockery on the left, the love on the right. She would need them both in the weeks to come. On the nights when her body screamed and her spirit wavered and the loneliness pressed down on her like the weight of all that earth, she would look up at those two pieces of paper, and she would keep going. There is a particular kind of loneliness that has no name. It is not the loneliness of being new somewhere, of not yet knowing a single soul. It is the loneliness that comes after a life that was full, after a house that used to hold 2 cups on the counter every morning, and now held only 1. Maris knew that loneliness the way you know an old injury, not as a sharp pain anymore, as a dull, constant ache that lives in the bones and quietly changes the way you move through your own house. The evenings were the worst of it. She could manage the days. The work helped, but the evenings still ambushed her. That soft gold hour when the light went tender and slow, and she would catch herself, just for a heartbeat, listening for the sound of a key in the door, for the heavy, comfortable tread of boots in the hall, for a voice calling her name in that warm, teasing way that no one in the world would ever use again. "Maris, my girl, what have you gotten us into now?" He used to say that. He used to come home and stand in the doorway of whatever beautiful disaster she was in the middle of, and he never once asked her to stop. He just rolled up his sleeves. She would set 2 places at the table sometimes, without thinking. And then she would see what she had done, and she would put the second plate away again, quietly, the way you'd close the lid on something tender that ought not to be looked at too long. The greenhouse beneath the earth had been his idea. She let herself remember it in the long, silent hours underground, because the work gave her permission to. Because there was no one down there to see her face. He had read about it somewhere, some old farmer's trick from a cold and distant place, a way of stealing warmth from the deep ground when the surface had nothing left to give. And he had been delighted by it, the way he got delighted by all manner of impractical things. A man who collected ideas the way other men collected old coins. He had drawn it out one winter night at the kitchen table. She could still see him there, the lamp throwing gold across the paper, his glasses pushed up onto his forehead, his big, careful hands moving the pencil in slow, sure lines. "Imagine it," he had said, "the whole world frozen solid up top. Snow to the windowsills, and down underneath. Summer. Tomatoes in the dead of winter. Lemons, even. Wouldn't that just be something, Maris? And she, younger then, busier, certain there would always be more time. She had set a fresh cup of tea by his elbow and kissed the top of his head and said the words she would spend the rest of her life trying to take back. Someday, old man, someday. He had smiled at her. He had bent back over the paper and written something in the corner, small and careful, the way he wrote everything. And then, someday, had run out. The way it always does. Faster than anyone is ever ready for. The winter came down out of the mountains without warning. The only road closed under a wall of white, so high the plows turned back. The valley sealed shut, cut off from the rest of the living world. No way in, no way out. And in a small house at the end of a quiet street, the man who dreamed of summer underground had grown gravely ill. She had held his hand through the long, dark hours. She had wrapped him in every blanket they owned. She had waited for help that could not come, because the roads were gone, and the sky was a roaring blindness, and the world simply could not reach them in time. There had been no greenhouse, no summer beneath the snow. There had only been the cold, and the waiting, and the hand going slowly, terribly still in hers. So now she built it, not as a monument. She was too practical for that, and far too proud. She built it because he had been right, and she had been wrong. And the only way she knew how to say, "I'm sorry" to a man who was gone, was to finally believe him. Every block she laid was an apology. Every beam she raised was a promise. Never again. Never again will I sit helpless in the dark while someone I love slips away because the world decided we were not worth reaching. Never again. She had to go into town, eventually, for the things she could not make herself. Seeds, mostly. Bulk packets of heirloom stock. Lengths of tubing. A particular kind of fitting for the water barrels. The general store sat at the center of everything, the way such places do in small towns. The kind of store where everyone's business became everyone's knowledge before the door had even finished swinging shut behind you. Earl Whitford ran it. A friendly, soft-bellied man who liked a joke and meant no real harm by any of them, which is its own kind of harm when you are on the receiving end. He scanned her seed packets one by one, and he could not help himself. "Stocking up for the end of the world, Maris?" He chuckled, ringing up the heirloom tomatoes. "Heard you got quite the operation going over there." "Just getting ready for winter, Earl." "Winter?" He shook his head, amused. "We got a truck comes twice a week, rain or shine, whole store full of food, right here. And you're out there planting a garden under the ground like the Dickens himself is coming." He bagged her seeds, grinning. "You take care now, you hear? Don't go disappearing down that rabbit hole for good." A few shoppers near the register laughed softly, not cruelly, just easily. The way people laugh at something they're certain they understand. Maris paid in exact change. She gathered her bag, and at the door she paused and turned and looked back at the warm, bright, well-stocked store, full of people who had never once gone hungry. "The truck comes twice a week, Earl," she said quietly, "until the day it doesn't." And she walked out into the biting wind before anyone could find a joke to answer her with. The town's patience, such as it was, ran out before hers did. Mayor Pike came back on a cold, bright afternoon, and this time he did not come alone. A man from the county rode with him, a thin, official sort of man with a thin official briefcase, the kind of man whose entire purpose in life is to inform other people of the rules. They found Maris up to her elbows in the work, fitting a heavy pane of thick, cloudy glass into the angled frame of the roof. Maris! Pike's voice had lost its earlier softness. There were people watching now. There was a process to follow. We talked about this. The deadline's near, and that... He waved a hand at the structure, which now rose from the earth like the curved back of some sleeping creature. That has not been dealt with. This is Mr. Hollis, from the county. He's here about the lien. The thin man opened his thin briefcase. Maris wiped her hands on a rag. She did not look worried. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle the two men. A guilty woman argues, a frightened woman pleads, but Maris Calloway simply stood there with the low winter sun behind her and waited. "There's a form," the county man began. "Several, in fact. The structure is in violation of—" "It isn't a structure," Maris said. The man paused. "I beg your pardon?" "It isn't a structure." She said it again, pleasantly, the way you'd correct a child's arithmetic. "Not under your own code. I've read it. All of it. Took me 3 long nights at the kitchen table, but I read every page, twice." Pike's eyes narrowed. "Maris." "A structure," she went on, unhurried, "is defined as a roofed enclosure intended for human habitation, for storage, or for commercial use." She nodded toward the glass and earth behind her. "No one is going to live in there. No one is going to store goods in there, and no one is going to sell so much as a single tomato that comes out of it." A small, dry smile. "It's an experimental agricultural enclosure for the cultivation of plant life, and that, Mr. Hollis, falls under an entirely different section of your code." The county man was flipping through his papers now, his confidence draining by the page. "There's a provision," Maris continued, "tucked away near the back, an old one. I don't imagine anyone's looked at it in a great many years. It allows for subsurface horticultural enclosures, provided they don't exceed a certain footprint, and don't tie into the public water or sewer lines." She spread her hands, palms up. Dirt worked deep into the creases. "Mine doesn't. I ran the numbers twice. I was an engineer, Mr. Hollis. Running the numbers is the one thing in this life I have never once been bad at." Silence. The thin man looked down at his papers. And the papers, it seemed, agreed with her. Pike's jaw worked. "You're telling me you found a loophole." "I'm telling you," Maris said gently, "that I found the truth. There's a difference, Warren. Though I understand it can be awful hard to see from where you happen to be standing." The mayor's face went red. Not with rage exactly. With the particular, helpless humiliation of a careful man who has just been outmaneuvered by the very woman he came to crush. He had brought the county. He had brought the briefcase. He had brought the full weight of the rules down onto her gray head. And the rules had taken one look at Maris Calloway and quietly stepped to her side. "The original citation stands," he said stiffly. "The noise complaint. That much is valid, and I'll pay it today." She was already reaching into her jacket. "In full. Exact change, if you've brought the form." She had, in fact, folded the exact amount into her pocket that very morning. She had known he would come. She had been ready for him. They left without another word between them. The county man climbed into the SUV looking faintly embarrassed, like a man who had been brought along to witness an execution and had instead watched the condemned politely correct the executioner's paperwork. And Mayor Pike drove off with his order intact and his pride in ruins, gravel spitting from beneath his tires. Maris watched them go until the dust settled. Then she turned back to the glass. She had won. She knew she had won. But there is a particular flavor to a victory that no one celebrates with you. A hollowness to it. She stood alone in her torn-up yard in the cold, bright afternoon, having just defeated the whole machinery of the town with nothing but patience and arithmetic. And there was no one to tell. No warm voice in the doorway. No big, careful hands to clap her on the shoulder. No one to throw back his head and laugh and say, "That's my girl. Knew you'd get him. Knew it all along." She looked up at the pale sky for a moment. "Got him, old man," she said quietly, to no one at all. And the wind took the words away, the way it took everything, eventually. It was the child who found her first, not the parents, not the neighbors, not the curious townsfolk who drove past slow to gawk at the mad woman's hole in the ground. A child, a small girl, no more than 4, with a wild halo of curls and one mitten gone missing, who had wandered through a gap in the fence line one gray afternoon while her mother's back was turned. Maris was kneeling at the edge of the pit, fitting the last of the seals, when she felt the weight of someone watching her. She looked up, and there, on the very lip of the great dark hole, stood the little girl, peering down into it with enormous, fearless eyes. "Is that a dragon's house?" the child asked. Maris went very still. It had been a long time since a child had spoken to her. A long time since anyone had looked at her work and seen anything but madness in it. "No," Maris said carefully. "No dragons, I'm afraid. I'm sorry to disappoint you." The girl considered this with tremendous seriousness. "What's in it then?" "Right now, just dirt." A pause. "But soon, things are going to grow down there, even when it's snowing. Even when everything up here is white and frozen and dead." She found to her own surprise that her voice had gone soft. "Down there, it's going to be green and warm and alive." The little girl's eyes went round as coins. "Like summer?" And Maris felt something move in her chest, something she had not felt in years. "Yes," she said, "just exactly like summer." "Daisy!" The voice cut across the yard, sharp with the particular terror of a parent who has looked up and found her child gone. A young woman came running through the gap in the fence, thin, pale, her coat far too light for the weather, her face white with fear. She scooped the little girl up into her arms and held her tight. And only then did she seem to register where she was. Whose yard? Who was kneeling there in the dirt, watching them both? The fear on her face shifted into something more complicated. The town had told her about the crazy widow, too. "I'm so sorry," the young woman said quickly, backing toward the fence. "She slipped right out the gate. I didn't even... We'll go. I'm so sorry to have bothered you." "You're not bothering me," Maris said. The words came out before she could stop them. The young woman paused. "She's not afraid of much, your girl," Maris went on, rising slowly, her knees cracking in the cold. "Walked right up and asked me if I keep a dragon down there. That's a brave child you've got." The fear in the young mother's face flickered, and underneath it, Maris saw the rest of the story. The kind of story she was getting good at reading. The light coat, the missing mitten, the way the woman held her daughter like the child was the only warm thing left in all the world. Here was someone else, Maris understood, who knew what it was to be cold. Tessa, the young woman offered at last. The name came shy and uncertain, like she was not used to anyone asking for it. And this is Daisy. Maris. I know, Tessa said, and then flushed, embarrassed. I mean, everyone. I'm sorry. Everyone says I'm crazy. Maris almost smiled. It's all right. They aren't entirely wrong. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone laughed at her joke instead of at her. It was a small sound, tired, but real. She came back. That was the thing that surprised Maris most. 2 days later, there was Tessa at the edge of the yard again, hovering, the little girl's hand clutched in hers. A covered dish balanced awkwardly in the crook of her arm. I made too much, Tessa said, which was plainly not true, because a woman in a coat that thin does not make too much of anything. I don't know. I thought you might. Maris looked at the dish, at the thin coat, at the pride that was costing this young woman everything to stand there and pretend the giving ran the other way. She understood that pride. She had worn it herself for years. Why don't you bring it inside? Maris said. Kettle's already on, and the girl can warm up. It's no kind of afternoon to be standing about in the cold. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where a man had once sketched dreams in lamplight. Daisy drank cocoa with both hands wrapped around the cup, and Tessa, slowly, in pieces, told a little of her story. Not much. Just enough. A husband gone, one way or another. A town that had not made room for her. A winter coming on that she did not know how she would afford to heat against. Maris did not offer advice. She had never had patience for advice. She just listened, and the listening did something to the young woman. You could see it. The way a plant that has been kept too long in the dark will turn, almost without meaning to, toward the smallest crack of light. They look at me the way they look at you, Tessa said quietly, when the girl had wandered off to study the strange tools by the door. Like I'm a problem they're hoping someone else will solve. She turned her cup in her hands. I used to think if I just smiled enough, said the right things, somebody would, I don't know, open a door. They won't, Maris said, not unkindly, just plainly. Not the ones you're waiting on. People are slow to make room, child. It's the truest thing I know about them. She set down her own cup. But every now and then, the door you needed turns out to be one you didn't expect, one you'd already half walked past. Tessa looked at her, and neither of them said anything more about it. They didn't need to. When the cocoa was gone and the light began to fail, Maris walked them to the door, and she pressed a folded bill into Tessa's hand before the young woman could refuse it, folded it small and fast, the way Tessa had pretended to make too much soup. For the girl's mittens, Maris said before there could be any argument, she's down to one. A child ought to have two. Tessa's eyes filled. When the garden's grown, Maris told her gently, opening the door onto the cold, you bring her back. She wanted summer. I mean to have summer to show her. And the young mother and her curly-headed child went out into the gathering dark, a little warmer than they'd come. After they had gone, Maris stood alone in the dimming light. The yard was quiet again, the pit gaped dark and patient at her feet, and through the kitchen window she could just make out the 2 pieces of paper pinned above her workbench, the cruel little cartoon, and the tender old drawing with its faded words in the corner, "For when the roads close, so we never wait again." She had built this thing to keep herself from ever being helpless again. That had been the whole of it in the beginning. A fortress of one. A promise to a dead man, and a wall against a hard world that had taken him. But a child had looked into her hole in the ground and seen summer. And a frightened young mother had laughed at her joke and come back and sat at her table. And standing there in the cold, Maris Calloway felt the first faint stirring of something she had not let herself feel since the winter the snow took everything. The suspicion that a wall built only to keep the world out might, if a person were not careful, slowly become a place where the world could be let back in. She did not have words for it yet. She only knew that the loneliness, for one afternoon, had loosened its grip on her throat. The structure was finished as the last warm days surrendered to the deepening cold. From the street, it looked like almost nothing at all. A low slope of cloudy glass rising barely 3 feet above the ground. Like a greenhouse that had thought better of the whole idea and decided to hide. The town drove past and saw a sad little shed, a monument to an old woman's grief, and they shook their heads and felt, most of them, a vague and easy pity. They had no idea what lay beneath it, because down a flight of sturdy wooden steps, past a heavy insulated door that sealed out the world with a soft and final hush, there was another country entirely. She had carried it down piece by piece, bag after bag of dark, rich earth, long cedar beds, raised and waiting and smelling of fresh-cut wood. Tall black barrels ranged along the cold north wall, filled with water, ready to drink the daylight and breathe it back as warmth through the long, dark hours. And up along the angled glass, a soft glow of grow light she could call on when the winter sun grew thin and pale. Run off a battery bank she had charged all autumn and learned to ration like a miser counts coins. A gentle, otherworldly wash of color, pink and violet, like the light at the edge of a dream. She had thought of everything. That was the thing the town would never understand. She had not built a hole. She had built a system, a living machine with margins and reserves, balanced as carefully as any bridge she had ever set across a river. She knew exactly how much heat the deep earth would lend her, and how much the black water would hold, and how little light a plant truly needs to keep its small green fire burning. She knew, too, the thing that the cartoon and the laughing shoppers did not, that when the snow came and lay deep and heavy across the glass, it would not be her enemy. It would be her blanket. The day she planted the first seeds, she did it slowly, reverently. She pressed each one into the warm, dark soil with the tip of one finger, and she spoke to them as she went, the way her husband had once spoken to his foolish, impractical, beautiful ideas. "Grow," she told them. "Go on now. Grow." And then she sat down on the bottom step, in the green-lit hush, in the warm, breathing dark deep below the frozen world, and she let herself rest, just for a moment. Above her, the surface of the earth was hardening toward winter. Above her, the town slept its easy sleep, certain of its trucks, certain of its wires, certain of all its tidy little rules, and above all of them, far higher than anyone in the valley thought to look. The sky had begun, very quietly, to change. But down here in the place a dead man had dreamed and a living woman's own 2 hands had built, something green was already reaching toward the light, and the old woman they called crazy closed her eyes in the warmth. And for the first time in a very long time, she was not afraid of the cold that was coming. She was ready for it. The whispers said it would be nothing. A dusting, the easy voices agreed. A pretty little snow to make the rooftops sparkle. Nothing the valley couldn't handle. Folks went about their business the way folks always do when they believe the worst is something that happens to other people, in other places, in other times. They strung their lights. They planned their suppers. They left their boots by the door and did not think to check the woodpile. The store stayed warm and bright and full. The trucks were due, as the trucks were always due, and so the town slept, certain of every certain thing. Maris Calloway did not sleep much at all. She stood at her kitchen window in the small dark hours, a cup of tea going cold in her hands, and she watched the sky. There was something wrong with it. She could not have explained it to anyone who hadn't lived through the other winter, the one nobody in town liked to talk about anymore. But she had lived through it. She had felt the air go strange and heavy in just this way once before. She had watched the light turn this particular shade of waiting. The animals knew it too. The neighbor's dog had been pacing and whining for 2 days. The birds had gone quiet. And down in the warm, dark earth, where her hands lived now, the ground itself seemed to hold its breath. "It's coming, isn't it?" she said softly to the man who wasn't there. The window gave her back only her own reflection. A gray-haired woman, alone, watching a sky that had not yet shown its face. She set down her tea, and she began, quietly, methodically, to get ready. She filled every container she owned with water, and then she filled the bathtub too. She checked the heavy battery bank in the basement, the one that fed the lights beneath the earth. She topped off the fuel for the little camp stove. She checked the seals on the great insulated door, ran her hands along every joint, the way she had once checked the bones of things that other people's lives depended on. She did not panic. Panic was a luxury for people who hadn't seen the worst already. She simply moved through her house and her work in the gray pre-dawn, setting each thing in its place, the way a sailor lashes down the deck before a wind he can feel but cannot yet see. And the whole time, in the back of her mind, 2 small faces. A young mother in a coat too thin for the weather. A curly-headed child who had asked her once if she kept a dragon. The little place by the creek, Tessa had said. They didn't know many people here yet. Maris stood very still in the middle of her kitchen, thinking about that thin coat, about a fireplace that might not have enough wood, about how a winter could come down on a person who had no one, and how quickly the cold could find the ones the world had already forgotten. She would check on them. The moment it was light, she promised herself. The moment it was safe to be out. She did not know yet how fast safe was about to disappear. The first flakes came down in the late afternoon, soft and innocent, exactly as the easy voices had promised. For an hour, it was almost lovely. And then the sky changed. It did not cloud over the way an ordinary storm clouds over. It bruised, a deep, Sickly, purple-black spread across the horizon and swallowed the last of the light, and the temperature began to fall. Not gently, the way temperatures are meant to fall, but in a long, plunging drop that you could feel in your teeth. The wind arrived all at once, not a breeze, not a gust. A great shrieking wall of it that came howling down out of the mountains and slammed into the valley like something with a grudge. It carried the snow sideways now, thick and blinding, a white, roaring blindness that swallowed the houses one by one until you could not see your own hand at the end of your own arm. In an hour, the soft, pretty dusting had become something with no name the town wanted to say out loud. The kind of winter that comes maybe once in a lifetime, if you are unlucky. The kind of winter that does not forgive a thin coat, or an empty woodpile, or the certainty that the worst only happens to someone else. Inside her snug house, Maris watched the thermometer outside her window spiral downward, and downward, and downward still. This was not a storm. She had seen a storm. A storm passes. This was a siege, and she knew, with a cold certainty that settled into her bones, that the road would already be gone, that the wall of white was already rising across the only way in and the only way out, that the valley was being sealed shut, exactly as it had been sealed once before, on the worst night of her life. She thought of Tessa. She went to the door, and the wind threw it back against her with a force that nearly knocked the old woman from her feet, and the cold reached in and stole the breath right out of her chest, and she understood at once that she could no more cross to the little place by the creek tonight than she could fly. No one was crossing anything tonight. She forced the door shut against the screaming dark, and she leaned her back against it, and for one terrible moment, Maris Calloway felt the old helplessness rise up in her like floodwater. Not again. Please, not again. But this time she had built something. This time she was not waiting in the dark for help that could not come. This time she was ready. The town was not. It happened the way these things always happen, slowly, and then all at once. Somewhere out in the roaring dark, an old tree that had stood for longer than anyone living could remember finally lost its long argument with the wind. It came down with a sound like the end of the world, straight across the lines that carried light and warmth into every home in the valley. And the lights went out, all of them, at once. From one breath to the next, the whole town dropped into a darkness so complete it seemed to have weight. For a while, nobody worried. That was the saddest part, looking back. For a while, they lit their candles and wrapped themselves in blankets and told one another it would only be a few hours. The trucks would come. The men in the bright vests would come. Someone always came. They waited for headlights that would not arrive, because the road was gone. The plows had turned back in the face of a wind that could lift a grown man off his feet. And there was no one out there in the white, roaring dark to come and save anybody. They were on their own. They simply did not know it yet. By the time the second day broke gray and merciless, they knew. The snow had not stopped. It fell and fell and fell, piling against the doors, climbing the windows, swallowing the cars in the driveways until they were only soft, white shapes, like furniture under sheets in a house no one lived in anymore. The way out of the valley was buried under a wall higher than a man could reach. The town was cut off from the whole of the living world, And up and down the cold, dark streets, the easy certainties began, one by one, to die. The store was the first to break. Earl Whitford had managed to get a little generator going, just enough to keep one bank of emergency lights humming over the registers. And when he opened his doors that morning, meaning to let folks in a few at a time, in an orderly fashion, the way decent people behave, the crowd came through him like water through a broken dam. Folks, please. His voice was lost at once. It took less than 2 hours. 2 hours, and the warm, bright store that Earl had laughed from behind only weeks ago was stripped down to the bare metal shelving. People who had been neighbors all their lives shoved one another aside over dented cans and softening bread and boxes of crackers gone stale on the shelf. A man and a woman actually fought, over the last sack of flour, until it split between them and spilled across the dirty floor. And they both went down on their knees in the cold to scoop it up with their bare hands. Earl stood behind his useless register and watched his whole settled world come apart. He thought of the gray-haired widow. He thought of what she'd said at the door, the last time, in her quiet voice. The truck comes twice a week, Earl, until the day it doesn't. And Earl Whitford, who had laughed, did not feel much like laughing anymore. The mayor did not help matters. Warren Pike was a man who loved order, and order was the first thing the cold killed. In his panic, reaching for whatever scrap of control he could still put his hands on, he took it upon himself to gather up the last of the bottled water from the gutted store and have it carried to the town hall. For safekeeping, he said, for fair distribution, for emergencies. But the people saw a man taking water out of their reach, and something ugly woke up in the crowd, and the arguments that broke out in those bare aisles were not the arguments of neighbors anymore. They were the arguments of the cold, and the cold does not care who is right. By the third day, the cold came indoors. Without the wires to feed it, every furnace in the valley sat dead and silent, and the temperature inside the houses began its slow, terrible fall toward the temperature outside. Pipes froze, and then they burst, and then the water turned to ice across kitchen floors. People retreated into single rooms. They wore every garment they owned, all at once, and still their breath hung white in the air before their faces. They burned what they had. First the firewood, for those who'd had the sense to keep some. Then the furniture, chairs, bookshelves, the legs off tables that had hosted 100 family suppers. Anything that would catch, anything that would give back a few minutes of borrowed warmth against the dark that was closing in. And in a small place down by the creek, a young mother sat wrapped in every blanket she owned, holding her shivering child against her chest, watching the last of a thin woodpile burn down to nothing. She did not know how she would keep the girl warm when it was gone. She only knew that she would, that mothers always do, that they find a way, or they die trying, and there is no third thing. But 30 steps and a whole world away from all that freezing dark. There was summer. Maris Calloway unlatched the heavy insulated door, and she went down the sturdy wooden steps into the earth. And the moment the door sealed shut above her, the screaming of the storm simply stopped. It vanished. In its place came a profound, muffled, holy silence. The kind of quiet you only find deep underground, where the world and all its troubles cannot reach. She unzipped her heavy coat. Down here, It was warm. The black barrels along the north wall had done exactly what a dead man had promised all those years ago at a lamp-lit kitchen table. And the deep snow piled now upon the glass overhead was not her enemy. It had become a blanket, a thick white quilt sealing the earth's warmth in, holding the killing cold out, so that even with the pale sun hidden for days, the garden kept its slow, steady breath. The barrels gave back what light they had drunk, gentle and even, wrapping around her like an embrace. And the smell, oh, the smell! She stood at the bottom of the steps and simply breathed it in. Damp, fertile earth, sweet basil, the bright green sharpness of tomato vines, and underneath it all, faint and impossible, the perfume of citrus blossoms from the two small trees in the corners, blooming in the dead of the cruelest winter in living memory. The grow lights washed everything in their soft, pink-violet glow. And everywhere she looked, green. Leafy greens spilling over the edges of the cedar beds. Heavy vines climbing the trellises, thick with fruit. Deep boxes of dark soil where potatoes and carrots and onions waited, patient and abundant beneath the surface. Rows upon rows of living, growing, breathing abundance, while the world above froze solid. She walked the narrow path between the beds. She reached up to a heavy vine and closed her old spotted hand around a tomato, a great ruby thing, warm to the touch, swollen with sweetness. She bit into it, and the juice ran down her chin, bright and acidic and alive, the taste of a summer that the world above her had completely forgotten existed. She had done it. She had truly done it. While the town tore itself apart over stale crackers and the last of the flour, the crazy widow stood alone in a warm green paradise, surrounded by more food than she could eat in a season. And she had never in her life felt so terribly, so completely alone. That was the thing the loneliness did down there in all that abundance. She had everything, and she had no one. She sat on the bottom step, the half-eaten tomato in her hand, and the silence that had felt holy a moment ago began, slowly, to feel like something else, like a tomb, like the inside of a wall she had built so high and so deep that nothing could ever hurt her again, and nothing could ever reach her either. She thought of the man who should have been there to taste this with her. He had drawn this. He had dreamed it into being one foolish winter night, while she set a cup of tea by his elbow and told him someday. And now, someday, had come. The summer underground was real. The frozen world above was real. Everything he had ever imagined had come true, and he was not here to see a single moment of it. "You'd have loved this, old man," she whispered into the green-lit dark. "You'd have stood right here and grinned like a fool and said I told you so until I couldn't stand it." Her voice cracked. "You always did have to be right." The leaves rustled faintly in the warm, circulating air. It was not an answer. But for a moment, in the place his dream had built, it was almost like having him close. She wiped her eyes with the back of one dirty hand, and then she thought again of the little place by the creek, of the thin coat, the single mitten, the fireplace that might already be cold, and the abundance all around her stopped feeling like a tomb, and started feeling like a question. What was the point of summer underground, the question asked, if you only ever ate it alone? She did not have an answer yet, but the question had taken root in her, down there in the warm dark, as surely as any seed. And questions like that, once planted, they grow. She did not hear it at first. She was pruning a cucumber vine, her hands busy and her mind far away, lost in worry for a young mother she could not reach. The storm above was only a distant, muffled hush down here, no more than the memory of a sound. But then, beneath it, something else, faint, rhythmic, coming down through the snow-buried glass overhead. Thump. She went still, the shears hovering in midair. Thump. She looked up at the frosted glass of the angled roof, where a thick blanket of snow pressed down out of the dark. Thump, thump, thump. And Maris Calloway knew exactly what that sound was. It was a hand. It was a fist, pounding on the buried hatch. Someone was out there in the killing cold. Someone had crossed the white roaring dark somehow, and found their way to the one strange patch of yard where the snow melted away from a glowing slope of glass. And now they were beating on her door with the last of whatever strength they had left. The outside world. The one that had mocked her, and fined her, and thrown bottles into her grave in the dark. The world that had called her crazy. It had finally run out of time, and now it was at her door. She dropped the shears. She went up those wooden steps faster than her old knees had any right to carry her, and she threw back the heavy latches, and she pushed up against the terrible weight of the snow. The wind hit her like a fist. Cold poured down into the warm green world, and snow hissed against the soil as it met the heat. And there, collapsed against the frozen frame of the hatch, was a shape. A woman, folded over on herself, half buried already, her skin a terrible translucent gray, her lips cracked and bleeding, her eyes rolled back, barely a flicker of life left in her at all. Maris seized her by the collar of her coat, and it was only then, as she hauled the freezing woman down out of the storm and into the light, that she saw the face. She knew that face. She had seen it 100 times, peering at her from behind a kitchen curtain. She had seen it on the porch across the way, watching her dig with cold disapproval. She had read its handwriting on a newspaper left folded atop her mailbox, weighted with a small, smooth stone. It was Glenda Marsh, the woman who had called the mayor, the woman who had called her crazy, the woman who had made certain Maris saw the cruel little cartoon, who had wanted the whole town to laugh. That woman, dying now in Maris Calloway's arms, on the threshold of the very thing she had mocked. The widow froze for one long, terrible heartbeat. The wind screamed. The snow poured in, and the choice hung there in the freezing air between them. The oldest, hardest choice there is: to remember every wound, or to let it go. Maris Calloway looked down at the face of the woman who had wronged her, and then she pulled her the rest of the way down into the warmth, and slammed the hatch shut against the storm. The silence rushed back in, holy, green, alive. And in the soft pink light, deep below the freezing world, an old woman knelt over the body of her enemy, and began, with her own 2 hands, to fight to bring her back. The broth was the first weapon. Maris had a little camp stove tucked into the corner and a battered metal pot, and she set water to boil before she had even finished pulling the frozen coat off the woman on the floor. Potatoes, kale, a handful of the dark leafy greens that grew in such reckless abundance down here. She did not measure. She did not think. Her hands simply moved, the way hands move when they have decided something the rest of you hasn't caught up to yet. She wrapped Glenda Marsh in a heavy silver blanket from her emergency kit. She laid her out on a bed of dry cedar shavings near the black barrels, where the stored warmth pressed back against the cold that had crawled so deep into the woman's bones. She chafed those gray, frost-bitten hands between her own. She talked low and steady the whole time, not because Glenda could hear her, but because the silence felt too much like the other silence, the one from the other winter, the one she had sworn she would never sit inside again. "Don't you dare," Maris said quietly, working warmth back into the lifeless fingers. "Don't you dare die in my husband's greenhouse, Glenda Marsh. Not you. You're far too stubborn for that. Stubbornest woman on the whole street, and that's saying something." The fire hissed under the pot. The green leaves stirred in the circulating air. And slowly, so slowly that at first Maris thought she had imagined it, the gray began to leave the woman's face. Glenda's eyelids fluttered. Her brain, sluggish and half-frozen, struggled to make sense of where she had washed up. She was not in heaven. She knew that much, because heaven would not smell of damp soil and basil and, impossibly, of blooming lemon trees. She was not in her own cold, dark house, where she had sat shivering until the walls themselves seemed to close in. She was somewhere warm. She was somewhere alive. A soft pink light bathed her face, and when she managed to turn her head, she saw, hanging directly above her, a cluster of heavy ruby tomatoes swaying gently from a vine that climbed toward a ceiling of frosted glass. For a long moment, Glenda Marsh simply stared at it, at the impossible summer fruit hanging over her head in the dead heart of the worst winter the valley had ever known. Then a battered metal cup appeared at her lips. "Drink," said a voice she knew. "Slow now. Small sips." Glenda drank. The broth was hot and rich, and it ran down into her hollow, frozen stomach like life itself returning. She had not known how empty she was until that first swallow. She had not known how close she had come to the end of everything until she felt herself, sip by sip, being called back from it. She wept. She could not help it. The tears came hot and silent, mixing with the broth on her chapped lips, and she did not even have the strength to wipe them away. And when she finally found her voice, it came out cracked and ruined and small. "It was me," Glenda whispered. "I called the mayor. I left that paper on your box. I told everyone you'd lost your mind." She squeezed her eyes shut. "I called you crazy, Maris, to anyone who'd listen." Maris said nothing. She only knelt there, refilling the cup. "Why?" Glenda choked out. "Why would you pull me out of that storm? After all of it? Why would you save me?" The old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she lifted the cup again to the lips of the woman who had wronged her, and she said the only thing that had ever made any sense to her, down in the deep, cold places of her life. "Because the cold doesn't care who was right, Glenda." A pause. "It just kills. It doesn't check first to see who deserved it. And I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to start letting it choose for me." She tipped the cup gently. "Now drink, and stop wasting good breath on apologies. You'll need it for shoveling soon enough." For a while, in the warm green hush, the two old women simply existed side by side. Glenda regained her strength slowly, and as she did, she watched. She watched the way Maris moved through the rows, pruning here, coaxing there, checking the soil with a fingertip the way another woman might check a child's forehead for fever. She watched her hand pollinate the tomato flowers, one by one, with a small humming device, a patient and meticulous labor that no one would ever see or thank her for. This was not the work of a mad woman. Glenda understood that now, lying in the cedar shavings, watching the old widow tend her impossible garden. This was the work of someone who had loved something so much that she had buried it deep in the earth where the world could never freeze it again. "That drawing," Glenda said one evening, nodding toward a square of paper Maris had pinned near the steps. "The one in pencil. That's not your hand." No. Maris did not look up from the vine she was tying. "That was Gideon's." "Your husband." "My husband." A long pause. "He dreamed all this up, you know, years ago. Sat at our kitchen table some nights and drew it out like a child draws a castle. And I laughed at him." Her hands stilled on the vine. "I told him someday. And then the snow came, the way it's come now, and someday ran out of road." She finally looked at Glenda, and her eyes were dry, but very old. "He died waiting for help that couldn't reach us, right here in this town, with everybody warm and certain and just a few feet of snow away." Glenda Marsh, who had spent years finding it easier to mock this woman than to remember why she might grieve, lay very still in the cedar shavings and felt the full weight of what she had done. "I'm sorry, Maris," she said again. But this time it was different. This time it was not the broth talking. "I'm so sorry. For all of it." "I know," Maris said. And she did. And for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the silence between the two women was not the silence of enemies. It was something gentler. It was the beginning, perhaps, of something neither of them had expected to find again at their age. A friend. But the warmth could not stay hidden forever. Up above, in the freezing dark, desperation was curdling into something far more dangerous. Mayor Warren Pike had watched the last of his own borrowed warmth burn down to ash. He had watched his wife shiver beneath 3 blankets in a single cold room, her lips going the color of a bruise. He had watched the people he was sworn to lead turn into something he did not recognize, fighting over scraps in the dark. And somewhere in those long frozen hours, the careful, orderly man he had always been cracked straight down the middle. He remembered the citation. He remembered the hole in the ground he had mocked, the heated agricultural trench, the crazy widow and her summer underground, and a cold, primitive voice in the back of his starving mind began, very quietly, to whisper, "She has food. She has warmth. She has everything. And you have nothing left to lose." He gathered a few men, Earl Whitford among them, though Earl did not like the look in the mayor's eye, and said so, and was ignored. And Warren Pike took down the hunting rifle that hung over his own cold hearth, and he told himself it was for the wolves, for protection, for safety. But deep down, in the place where men keep the truths they cannot say out loud, he knew exactly what the gun was for. Survival had become a game with only one rule, and Warren Pike had decided, somewhere in the dark, that he intended to win it. They broke into the house first. It was a tomb. The pipes had burst and frozen, sheeting the floors in ice, the cold so deep inside the walls that their breath plumed white in the dead front room. "She's gone," Earl muttered, his voice hollow. "Old Maris didn't make it. Look at this place." "No." The mayor stood at the kitchen window, staring out at the buried backyard. "Look, out in the white waste, in the dead center of all that snow, a thin column of steam rose from a small pipe poking up through the drifts, and where everything else lay frozen and dead, one strange rectangular patch of ground showed clear. The snow melted back from a slope of faintly glowing glass. The men waded out through the drifts. They found the heavy hatch. And Warren Pike did not bother to knock. He jammed a steel bar beneath the latch, and he threw his whole starving weight against it, and the lock splintered, and the hatch flew open, and 4 desperate men came pouring down the wooden steps into the warm green light, and stopped dead. They stood there, frozen mid-step, as the impossible hit them all at once. The heat, the color, the overwhelming living smell of basil and ripe fruit and blossoming citrus. Rows upon rows of vibrant, breathing green, stretching out before them in the soft pink glow, while a once-in-a-lifetime winter raged above their heads. It was a garden of paradise, hidden in the heart of a frozen hell. And at the far end of it stood Maris Calloway, a steel spade in her 2 hands. Beside her, wrapped in a silver blanket, stood Glenda Marsh, alive. The men gaped at her, at the woman they had all assumed was dead in her cold house, at the woman the mayor's own panic had nearly let freeze in the dark. "Maris," Pike rasped. His eyes darted from the food to the woman, to the food again. Hunger and shame and terror all at war in his ruined face. "By the authority vested in me as mayor, I am commandeering this structure and everything in it for emergency use." His voice shook. "We are taking the food." The rifle came up, just slightly, and the small metallic click of the safety sliding off echoed through that warm green space like a thunderclap. Glenda screamed, but Maris Calloway did not move. She stood her ground at the end of her husband's garden, the spade steady in her old hands, and she looked down the barrel of that rifle with the eyes of a woman who had already faced the very worst thing the world could do to her, and survived it. "Put it down, Warren," she said. Her voice was not loud. That was the strange thing. It was quiet and level, and somehow it filled the whole green room more completely than any shout could have. "My wife is freezing," Pike choked. Tears stood frozen on his cheeks. "Half the town is starving in the dark. I am not asking you, Maris. I am telling you, we are taking the harvest." "And then what?" The question stopped him. "You tear these plants up by the root," Maris went on. "You rip out these beds in a panic and haul off everything green you can carry. And you'll eat for 3 days, maybe 4. She took one slow step toward him, the spade still in her hands. "And then the roots will be dead. The soil will go cold. The whole thing collapses. And there's nothing. Nothing for anyone. Not for your wife. Not for those children out there. Nothing but a looted hole in the ground and a longer, slower way to die." She held his eyes. "You don't know how this works, Warren. You never wanted to know. You called it crazy, and you fined me for it, and you laughed." Her voice dropped, low and fierce. "But I know exactly how it works. And right now, in this whole frozen valley, I am the only one who does." The rifle trembled in the mayor's hands. "She's hoarding," Pike said, but the conviction was draining out of him with every word. She knew. She knew this was coming, and she hid it from us. I hid nothing. The words came out of Maris Calloway with a force that stunned every man on the steps into silence. "I dug a hole in plain sight in my own backyard where the whole town could watch me do it. I built this thing while you stood right there and threatened to take my house." Her hand swept toward the glowing glass overhead, toward the buried world above. "I told you the trucks wouldn't always come. I told Earl, right there at his register. I warned you, every single one of you. And you threw bottles into my grave and drew me in your funny papers and called me a mad old woman." She was shaking now, not with fear, with years of it. "Don't you dare stand in my husband's garden and call me a hoarder. I didn't take your warmth, Warren. You gave it away. You gave it away laughing." Earl Whitford was the one who moved. He stepped forward, his big hand closing over the barrel of the rifle, and he pushed it down toward the dirt floor, gently but firmly, the way you'd lower the arm of a man about to do something he could never take back. "Warren," he said quietly, "look at her. Look where you are. You're going to shoot an old woman over potatoes? In front of God and everybody." His voice cracked. "She just told you the truth. The same truth she told me weeks ago, and I laughed too. We all laughed." The mayor stood there, the gun sinking in his hands. And then something in Warren Pike simply gave way. The rifle slipped from his fingers and clattered to the dirt. And the proud, careful man who loved order above all things sank down onto his knees in the soil of the garden he had come to plunder. And he wept. Great, broken, helpless sobs. The sound of a man whose whole world had failed and who knew, finally, that the failing was his own. "I don't know what to do," he sobbed into his hands. "I failed them. I'm supposed to lead them, and I failed every last one of them. They're dying out there, and I don't know what to do." Maris Calloway looked at the broken man kneeling in her husband's garden, and the anger that had carried her this far slowly, slowly began to drain away, because she had knelt like that once. She had felt that exact helplessness, holding a cold hand in a dark room, knowing that the world had cut her off, and there was nothing she could do. She had built this whole green country so that she would never feel that way again. And here was Warren Pike, feeling it now for the very first time. She lowered the spade. She crossed the soft soil slowly, and she stood over the weeping mayor, and she looked at him for a long, long moment. "Get up, Warren," she said, and her voice was not hard anymore. She walked to a wooden crate and pulled out a heavy sack of potatoes and a great bundle of dark leafy greens, and she set them down in front of him in the dirt. "You don't commandeer my husband's greenhouse," she said quietly. "You don't take it at the end of a gun. That's not how anyone is going to live through this." She looked around at all the men. "But you don't have to steal from me either. Nobody in this valley has to steal from anybody. There's enough. If we're careful, if we do this right, there's enough to keep every soul in this town alive until the thaw comes." Earl Whitford lifted his head. You'd feed everybody? After everything?" "I'd keep them alive," Maris said. "Not fat, not happy, but alive. There's water enough in those barrels, root vegetables, greens with everything a body needs to keep its own fire going. She drew a breath. But it has to be done my way. I control the rationing. I control what gets cut and what stays standing, because I'm the only one who knows what this garden can give without dying. You break that rule, you kill us all. It was Glenda who spoke then, rising from her cedar bed, the silver blanket around her shoulders like a strange and battered crown. She's right, Glenda said, her voice still raw. I'd be a frozen corpse in my own kitchen right now if not for her. Every word out of her mouth is true. We do this her way. All of us. The men looked at one another, and one by one, in the warm green light of a dead man's dream, they nodded. But Maris Calloway had one condition. She held it back until the rest was settled, until the spade was put away and the rifle lay forgotten in the dirt and the shape of survival had been agreed upon. And then she crossed to Warren Pike, who was wiping his face with the back of a shaking hand, and she took him by the arm. "There's a young mother," she said, "down by the creek. Little place, all on its own. Her name's Tessa, and she's got a girl, 4 years old, named Daisy." Her grip tightened. "That woman has a coat too thin for autumn, let alone this. And nobody in this town ever once made room for her. Nobody checked, nobody knocked." The mayor went very still. "I couldn't reach them when the storm came," Maris said, and for the first time her own voice trembled. "I tried. The wind threw me back. And I have spent every hour since then sick with the thought of that child freezing in the dark, while I sat down here in the warm with more than I could ever eat." She looked Warren Pike dead in the eye. "Before one potato comes out of this ground for anybody else, you take these strong young men, and you go and you bring that mother and that child here, alive. You understand me, Warren? You go and you knock on the door this whole town forgot." For a moment, no one moved. Then the mayor of the broken town straightened his shoulders, there in the soil, and something that had been dead in him for 3 frozen days flickered faintly back to life. "Earl," Warren Pike said hoarsely, "get the others. We're going down to the creek." And Maris handed them rope and lanterns and the silver blankets from her kit, and she sent them back up the wooden steps into the screaming white dark, not to take, for the first time, to give. The hatch boomed shut behind them. And in the sudden warm silence, Maris Calloway stood among her husband's vines, and Glenda Marsh came and stood beside her, and the 2 old women watched the closed door together and waited and prayed in their separate silent ways that the world above had not run out of time for one thin coat and one small girl, that somewhere out there in the dark a dragon's house was still worth believing in. The waiting was the worst part. Down in the warm green hush, Maris Calloway and Glenda Marsh sat side by side on the bottom step, and they did not speak, and they did not pretend to work. They only watched the closed hatch and listened to the muffled roar of the storm above, and they counted the minutes the way the desperate count anything, too slowly and far too many times. An hour passed, maybe more. Time did strange things down there in the earth. And then, a sound, a scraping above, boots on snow, the heavy thud of someone fighting with the latch. The hatch flew open, and the cold poured down, and the men came stumbling back into the light one after another, crusted white, faces raw, breath ragged, and in Earl Whitford's arms, wrapped in a silver blanket, was a small, still bundle. Maris was on her feet before she knew she had moved. "Daisy, she's alive," Earl gasped, half falling down the last of the steps. "They're both alive. Cold. Lord, so cold. But alive." Behind him came Tessa, held up between two of the men, her lips gray, her thin body shaking so hard she could barely stand, but her eyes were open. And when those eyes found the warm green world around her, and the old woman rushing toward her child, something in the young mother's frozen face broke open with a relief so total it looked almost like grief. "You came," Tessa whispered. "Somebody came." "Of course somebody came," Maris said, taking the small bundle gently from Earl's arms, pressing the cold little face against the warmth of her own chest. "Of course somebody did, child. Did you think we'd forget you out there? Did you think nobody in this whole world would knock?" And Tessa Lund, who had believed exactly that, who had sat in the freezing dark, certain that no one was coming, because no one ever had, put her face in her hands and wept. They warmed the mother and child slowly, broth and silver blankets in the steady, patient heat of the black barrels, and little Daisy, who was tougher than her small size had any right to allow, came back to herself faster than anyone dared hope. Within the hour, she was sitting up in the cedar shavings, blinking at the impossible garden all around her, her wild curls flattened on one side from the blanket. She looked up at the heavy red tomatoes hanging over her head. She looked at the soft pink light and the green vines climbing toward the snow-buried glass and the lemon trees blooming in their corners. And then she looked at Maris, and her small face filled with wonder. "It's summer," Daisy breathed. "You said you'd have summer, and you did." Maris Calloway, who had not cried in front of another living soul in more years than she could count, had to turn away for a moment and press the back of her hand hard against her mouth. "Yes," she managed when she could speak. "Yes, little one, I did." And so, in the warm, dark heart of the cruelest winter the valley had ever known, a strange new world was born. The garden became the beating heart of the whole town. Word spread the way word does, even with no wires and no roads. Family by family, the survivors came through the storm to the widow's backyard, drawn by the impossible rumor of a place where the light still glowed and the food still grew. And Maris took them in, every one, the ones who had laughed at her, the ones who had thrown the bottles, the ones who had drawn the cartoon and read it out loud at the supper table, all of them. She did not keep a single ledger of who had wronged her. The cold, she had said, does not check first to see who deserves it. And neither, she decided, would she. It was a brutal, grinding routine, those days underground. They could not all crowd into the greenhouse. The garden could not breathe with so many bodies, and the soil needed its quiet. So they set up in Maris's house above, in the cold, dead rooms, and they made it work. Teams went out in shifts into the killing white, roped together so the storm could not steal them, to shovel snow into great pots. They hauled it down and melted it slow over small, careful fires in Maris's hearth, refilling the water stores barrel by barrel. Earl Whitford, who had spent a lifetime behind a register, turned out to have a gift for it. He managed the rations down to the last spoonful. 1 cup of thick vegetable stew per person per day. Not a drop more. not a drop less. He weighed and divided and recorded, and when a man grumbled that it wasn't enough, Earl looked him dead in the eye and said, "It's enough to keep your heart beating. That's all enough means now." And Glenda Marsh. Glenda became Maris's right hand. It was a strange thing to watch. The woman who had once campaigned to have the greenhouse torn out of the ground now stood guard over it like a lioness. She enforced Maris's rules without mercy. When a frightened, hungry boy tried to slip down the steps one night to steal a tomato off the vine, it was Glenda who caught him by the collar and marched him back up into the cold, and she who stood over the whole shivering crowd afterward and said in a voice that brooked no argument, "You touch those roots, you kill the roots, you kill the roots, you kill us all. This woman is keeping every one of you alive, and you will respect her garden, or you will answer to me." No one tried again, and Maris, watching her old enemy defend her husband's dream with such fierce devotion, understood that the storm had not only taken things from this town, it had given some too. But the garden was not made for this. Maris knew it, even if the others did not. A greenhouse built to feed one old woman was now feeding 50 souls and more. And the strange showed in everything she touched. The lush vines grew thin and weary. The root boxes emptied faster than the soil could give. She found herself harvesting vegetables before they were ready, pulling up half-grown potatoes and undersized carrots just to meet the day's count, because a hungry child cannot wait for a carrot to finish growing. She slept almost not at all. She moved through the green light like a phantom, checking the soil, balancing what the garden could give against what the people needed, fighting with every ounce of her old engineer's mind to keep the whole delicate living machine from tipping over the edge into collapse. Because she knew the truth she had told Warren Pike at the end of a gun. Push the garden too hard, and it would not bend. It would break, and there would be nothing left for anyone. She was tending it on her knees late one night, alone in the hush, when the worst of it came. It started with the sound of running feet on the steps. Tessa's voice, high and broken with terror, calling down into the dark. "Maris! Maris! Please! It's Daisy! She's burning up! She won't wake right! She's so hot! Oh God! Please!" And the old woman's blood turned to ice. She climbed those steps faster than her body could bear. And in the cold front room above, by the light of a single lantern, she found the little girl wrapped in blankets and shaking with a fever that radiated off her small body like heat off a stove. Her cheeks were flushed an angry red. Her eyes were glassy and far away, and her breath came too fast, too shallow. A small rattling sound that Maris Calloway knew. She knew it. She had heard breath like that before, in another cold, dark room. On another endless night when the roads were gone and no help could come, and the only thing in all the world she could do was hold a hand and wait, the terror rose up in her like floodwater. Not again. Not a child. Please, not a child. Not in front of me. Not when I can't. And for one paralyzing moment, Maris Calloway was not a strong-handed engineer who had outbuilt the winter. She was a helpless woman in the dark, watching someone she loved slip away while the whole frozen world looked on and offered nothing. It was Glenda who took her by the shoulders. "Maris." Glenda's voice cut through the panic, low and hard. "Maris, look at me. You are not back there. You hear me? This is not that night. Morris's eyes came up, wild and lost. This is not that night, Glenda said again, gripping her tight. You are not alone in the dark with no one coming. Look around you, woman. Look. And Maris looked, and the room was full of people. The whole frozen town, it seemed, had crowded into that cold front room. Earl and Warren Pike, and the men who had carried the rope and the lanterns, the neighbors who had laughed and the ones who had thrown bottles, all of them standing in the lantern light, waiting, ready, looking to her. This was not the other night. The other night, there had been only silence and snow and a hand going cold. This night, there were hands, dozens of them, willing, frightened, ready hands. And the helplessness that had drowned her for so many years suddenly cracked, and through the crack came something she had thought the first winter had killed in her forever. Purpose. She was not helpless anymore. She had built a world where help could not be cut off, because the help was already inside. Cool water, Maris said, and her voice came out steady and strong and sure. Not cold, cool. From the melt, not the snow. Cloths. We bring the fever down slow. You hear me? Slow, or we'll send her into shock. She was already moving. Glenda, the broth. Thin it with water. She needs liquid more than she needs anything. Tessa, look at me. You hold your girl and you talk to her. You keep her here with us. You do not stop talking, no matter what. Your voice is the rope. You hold her to it. And the room came alive around her. They moved like one body. Water was fetched and cooled. Cloths were wrung. The broth went thin and warm. And through the long, terrible hours of that night, the whole town that had once cast Maris Calloway out gathered instead around one small burning child. And they fought for her. They fought together. The fever broke just before dawn. Maris felt it under her hand first, the moment the angry heat began to loosen its grip. The moment Daisy's too fast breath slowed and deepened, and her small body went from rigid to merely blessedly limp with sleep. The little girl's eyes fluttered open. She looked up at the ring of exhausted faces hovering over her in the lantern light. She looked at her mother, whose voice had gone hoarse from hours of talking, of singing, of holding her child to the rope of the living world. And Daisy frowned, just slightly, the way children do. "Mama," she mumbled, "I'm thirsty." And the whole room, the whole tired, frozen, broken open town, let out a single breath it felt like it had been holding for 3 winters. Tessa sobbed and gathered her daughter up and rocked her, and Earl Whitford turned away and pretended very hard that something had gotten into his eye, and Warren Pike sat down heavily against the cold wall and put his face in his hands. And Maris Calloway, Maris stood and walked away from them all, to the dark window where the first gray light of morning was beginning to show. She pressed her old spotted hand flat against the freezing glass, and finally, after all the long frozen years, she let herself weep. Not for the child. The child would live. She wept for the man she had not been able to save, for the hand that had gone cold in hers while the world stood by, for the helplessness she had carried like a stone in her chest for so long she had forgotten it was not simply a part of her. "I couldn't save you," she whispered to the gray light, to the man who wasn't there, who was always almost there. "I couldn't reach you, Gideon. I have hated myself for it every single day. The window gave her back her own reflection, a gray-haired woman, but not alone this time. Behind her, in the lantern light, a whole town breathed and lived and wept with relief. But I saved her, Maris said softly. Tonight, I saved her. With your garden. With your dream. Her voice broke and steadied and broke again. It wasn't for nothing, old man. Someday came, and it wasn't for nothing. And in the green-lit dark below them, the vines reached on toward the light, the way living things always do. And something in Maris Calloway that had been frozen for a very long time finally began to thaw. The storm broke on the morning the child's fever did, as if the two were bound together somehow, as if the valley itself had been holding its breath, and now, at last, could let it go. Maris climbed the wooden steps, her joints aching, her face hollow with exhaustion, and she pushed the heavy hatch open into a world transformed. The sky was blue, not gray, not bruised, a blinding, flawless, impossible blue, stretching from ridge to ridge without a single cloud to mar it. The snow lay deep and white and silent over everything, soft dunes burying the cars and climbing the windows, and over it all the morning sun poured down so bright it brought tears to her tired eyes. The wind was gone. The shrieking dark was gone, and in its place was a silence so complete, so peaceful, that for a moment Maris simply stood there in the open hatch with the cold, clean air filling her lungs, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt that it was over, that they had made it through. And then, faint at first, then growing, came a new sound across the white valley. Not the wind, not a fist on a buried door. A deep, rhythmic, mechanical beat rolling in over the ridge. Chop, chop, chop. Rescue. The great machines crested the mountains one after another, their blades throwing up blinding clouds of snow, and the whole town came pouring out of the cold, dead houses into the dazzling light, waving blankets and arms and anything bright they could find, weeping and shouting and laughing all at once. The rescuers had braced themselves, coming over that ridge, for the worst. They had expected a valley of the silent dead, a town frozen in its homes, a place the winter had simply erased. Instead, they found 50 families and more, thin, exhausted, frost-bitten, hollow-eyed, but alive. Every last one of them, alive. When the rescuers came down into the snow and asked in baffled astonishment how on earth a cut-off valley had survived a winter like that one with no power and no road and no supplies, Warren Pike did not say a word. The mayor who had once mocked the hole in the ground, who had come to it at last with a gun in his shaking hands, simply turned and lifted one arm and pointed across the white expanse toward a small, unremarkable house at the end of a quiet street, toward a backyard where a slope of glass glinted in the morning sun, toward an exhausted old woman in a faded work jacket, quietly pulling a heavy hatch closed over a world of green. Maris Calloway wanted no part of what came after, not the gratitude that suddenly poured toward her from people who had crossed the street to avoid her only a season before, not the parade the town tried to throw when the deep thaw finally came and the roads opened up again. And when strangers came up the long road with cameras and bright lights, hungry for the story of the widow who grew summer beneath the snow, she locked her door and would not answer. She had not done it for any of that. But some things did change, and they changed for good. Warren Pike came to her porch one soft spring morning, his hat in his hands, his wife beside him, pale and thin from the long winter, but warm now, and alive. He did not make a speech. He had given up on speeches. He only said, quietly, that there would be equipment before the next snow. Stores laid by. A list of every soul in the valley who lived alone, so that no door would ever again go unknocked. "You warned us," he said. "I spent my whole life making things look orderly, Maris. You're the one who made sure they'd hold." He meant it as an apology. She took it as one. And by the new summer, you could not walk a single street in that valley without finding someone out in the yard with a shovel, sinking their own small fortress of green into the patient earth. Earl Whitford filled half his store with seed and tools and the heavy black barrels, and he could never keep them on the shelves. The cartoons stopped. The whispering stopped. Because the whole town had finally learned the thing Maris had learned the hard way, years before, in the dark, with a cold hand going still in hers, that the worst does not only happen to other people. That help is not something you wait for. It is something you build before you ever need it. But that was not the ending that mattered to Maris. The ending that mattered to her was smaller than all of that. Quieter. It was a kitchen table and 3 cups of tea where there used to be only one. Because Glenda Marsh came by most days now, and the 2 old women who had once been enemies sat together in the warm and argued companionably about everything and nothing the way only true friends can. And Tessa Lund and little Daisy were there more often than not. So often that the spare room had quietly become their room, and no one had ever had to say so out loud. The thin coat was gone, replaced by a good warm one. Daisy had 2 mittens now, always, and a habit of clattering down the wooden steps into the greenhouse the moment she arrived to check on her summer. The house that had held 1 cup and 1 silence now held voices and footsteps and the small bright chaos of a child. It was not the family Maris had lost. Nothing could ever be that, but it was a family. One she had not gone looking for. One the cruelest winter of her life had carried to her door and left in her keeping. A family she had been given, because she had chosen, in the end, to open the hatch instead of locking it. She never locked it again. That was the one thing she promised herself, that first spring. The heavy, insulated door that had once sealed her away from the whole world. She left it unlatched, always, day and night, in every season. Let the cold come back. It would, someday. The wires were still fragile. The roads could still close. The world was still the kind of place where the worst could arrive without warning and cut the living off from help. But if it came, if the dark closed in again and the snow rose against the doors, this time the door would be open. This time no one would have to pound on a buried hatch with the last of their failing strength, praying someone inside would choose to answer. This time, they could simply come in. She framed the drawing, finally, Gideon's drawing. The careful pencil lines, the gentle measurements, the words written long ago in the corner by a hand. She would have given anything to hold one more time. For when the roads close, so we never wait again. She hung it on the wall at the top of the wooden steps where everyone who came down into the green would pass it. where the whole town that had once laughed at a foolish old man's impractical dream would have to walk right by the proof that he had been right all along. And on a soft gold evening in the new summer, Maris Calloway stood at the bottom of those steps, in the warm, living hush of the place his love had built and her hands had finished, and she watched a small girl with wild curls move down the rows of vines, naming each plant with great seriousness, reaching up on her toes to touch the heavy, warm fruit. Tomato, Daisy announced. Lemon, cucumber. A pause and a frown of concentration. Summer. That's right, little one, Maris said softly. Summer. And the old woman who had buried her whole heart deep beneath the frozen ground felt that heart, at long last, come up into the light. Not the same as it had been. The cold had changed her. The loss had changed her. She would carry both of them in her bones for whatever time she had left, but changed was not the same as broken, and a heart that has been frozen and grieved, and finally allowed to thaw, grows things, the way all living things do, when at last they are given a little warmth and a little light, and the simple, stubborn grace of not being left alone in the dark.